The Petticoat Affair. Scandal in Jackson's cabinet. 1829-1831. A nation of honor and reputation. In the 1820s, America was still young, raw, and fiercely protective of social respectability. The country was transitioning from the genteel politics of the Founding Fathers to the populist democracy of Andrew Jackson, a man of the frontier, a war hero, and a president who prided himself on defending personal honor. But Jackson's presidency would soon be consumed by a scandal that began not in Congress or the battlefield, but in the parlors and drawing rooms of Washington society. It became known as the Petticoat Affair. At its heart was Margaret Peggy Eaton, a woman whose beauty, wit, and independence challenged the rigid moral expectations of her time and nearly tore apart Jackson's cabinet. The rise of Margaret O'Neill. Eaton. At the turn of the 19th century, Washington, D.C. was not yet the grand capital it would one day become. It was a modest, muddy town filled with half-finished buildings, boarding houses, and the constant hum of political ambition. And in the heart of it all stood a woman whose charm and confidence would one day shake the foundations of the American presidency. Her name was Margaret O'Neill. Margaret O'Neill, known to friends as Peggy, was born in 1799, the daughter of William O'Neill, owner of a popular Washington boarding house and tavern called the Franklin House. It was not merely a place to eat and sleep. The Franklin House was Washington's living room, a crossroads of power and gossip, where senators, soldiers, and journalists shared food, drink, and political secrets. In this world, young Peggy grew up surrounded by conversation of war heroes, statesmen, and rising leaders shaping the early republic. She listened, observed, and learned how men wielded influence with words as much as weapons. She became witty, intelligent, and fearless in speech, qualities that made her fascinating and, to some, dangerous. By her teenage years, Peggy was already the talk of Washington society. Men praised her beauty and intelligence. Women whispered about her confidence. She did not shrink from attention. She met it head-on. She spoke freely, laughed loudly, and engaged men in political conversation, something most proper women of her era would never dare. Her independence, however, came at a cost. To the ladies of high society, Peggy's behavior broke the unwritten rules of womanhood. A woman's virtue, they believed, was measured not only by morality, but by silence. And Peggy O'Neill refused to be silent. At 16, she married John Timberlake, a purser in the United States Navy, a steady older man who offered respectability and stability. But stability in those days often came at a distance. Timberlake's duties kept him at sea for years at a time, while Peggy remained in Washington, managing their affairs and helping her father at the Franklin House. There, she found herself once again surrounded by the world she'd grown up in, the lively, masculine world of politics and persuasion. It was in this setting that she met Senator John Henry Eaton, a man 10 years her senior, charming, influential, and one of Andrew Jackson's closest allies. Eaton, like many men, was captivated by Peggy's energy, her laughter, her conversation, her unshakable self-assurance. She wasn't like the women he'd known in Washington drawing rooms. She was alive, electric, unapologetically herself. Their friendship soon became the subject of whispered rumors. Gossip spread through the city, whispers that blurred the line between friendship and something more. Peggy's husband, often away at sea, became the subject of cruel speculation. In the tight circles of Washington society, a woman's reputation was currency, and Peggy's was being quietly spent. But to understand the storm that would follow, we must remember the times. This was an America obsessed with honor, a society where a man's word could lead to a duel, and a woman's virtue defined her family's status. To be accused, even without proof, was to be condemned. And for Peggy O'Neill Timberlake, those whispers would never be fully silenced. In 1828, tragedy struck. While stationed aboard a naval ship, John Timberlake died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause was illness, but rumor said otherwise. Whispers claimed he had taken his own life, distraught over his wife's rumored closeness to Senator Eaton. No one could prove it, but in the eyes of polite society, Peggy's guilt was assumed. Even before she remarried, the verdict of Washington's social elite had been passed. Peggy Eaton was a woman of tainted virtue, but Peggy refused to disappear into shame. In less than a year after her husband's death, she married John Henry Eaton, now a respected senator and loyal friend of General Andrew Jackson. It was a union of affection, but also defiance. To their enemies, it was scandalous, far too soon, too bold, too improper. To Peggy, it was simply love and the right to live on her own terms. But marriage did not bring acceptance. If anything, it deepened the hostility. The women of Washington, especially those of the political elite, refused to acknowledge her. They would not call on her, would not invite her to dinners, and would not sit beside her in church. Behind closed doors, the whispers grew louder, and when Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, the man of the people, entered the White House in 1829, he brought Peggy and John Eaton with him. Eaton was named Secretary of War, a powerful post in Jackson's cabinet. But to the women of Washington, it was unthinkable that such a woman should now dine with their husbands at the president's table. What began as gossip in a tavern would soon spiral into a national scandal, one that divided a cabinet, ended political careers, and tested the loyalty of those closest to the president himself. And for Andrew Jackson, a man scarred by personal loss and driven by the defense of honor, the treatment of Peggy Eaton would reopen old wounds and ignite one of the fiercest social and political battles in American history. Margaret O'Neill Eaton had risen from a boarding house girl to the center of Washington power. But the same society that once admired her spirit would soon turn against her, with consequences that no one could have foreseen. Because in the age of Jackson, even a whisper could bring down a government. John Timberlake's death was more than a personal tragedy. It became the spark that ignited one of the greatest social and political controversies in early American history. By the late 1820s, Washington society was a web of appearances, gossip, and unwritten codes of propriety. Men rose and fell through politics, but women's power came through reputation, and reputation was fragile. When the news reached the capital that John Timberlake, the naval purser husband of Margaret Peggy Timberlake, had died while serving aboard the USS Constitution in the Mediterranean, sympathy quickly gave way to speculation. The official reports listed his death as a result of pulmonary disease, but whispers suggested something darker. The rumor spread that Timberlake, tormented by the scandals surrounding his wife and her friendship with Senator John Henry Eaton, had taken his own life. There was no proof, but proof was unnecessary. In a city built on rumor, gossip was as powerful as truth. For Peggy, the loss was devastating. Whatever the state of her marriage, she had been a wife, and now she was a widow. Yet even in mourning, she found herself under the cruel scrutiny of Washington's social elite. Every decision she made, every visit she received, every word she spoke was interpreted as a sign of guilt or impropriety. Her friendship with Senator Eaton, already a subject of whispered disapproval, now became the focal point of a moral inquisition. Eaton, deeply concerned for Peggy's well-being, visited her regularly, offering comfort and practical help in a society that had largely abandoned her. To outsiders, it looked like scandal confirmed. In less than 9 months after Timberlake's death, Peggy and John Henry Eaton married. To them, the union seemed natural. Both were adults, both were free, and both had found affection in one another's company long before the tragedy at sea. But in the eyes of Washington society, their marriage was indecently hasty, an affront to the conventions of mourning and propriety. A widow, they said, should retreat from the world for at least a year, shrouded in black and grief. Peggy did not conform to those expectations. Her decision to marry again so soon became the proof her critics needed to brand her as shameless. John Eaton, however, saw the situation differently. A loyal friend to Andrew Jackson and an ambitious statesman in his own right, he viewed the marriage as both an act of love and defiance. He had known Peggy for years, admired her intelligence and warmth, and refused to let rumor dictate his choices. For Andrew Jackson, who had himself suffered the vicious slanders of Washington society, the marriage struck a deeply personal chord. During his own presidential campaign, Jackson's beloved wife Rachel had been accused of adultery due to a misunderstanding over her divorce, and she died shortly after the election, her health broken and her spirit wounded. Jackson believed that gossip had killed her. Now, seeing his friend Eaton and Peggy under similar attack, he felt compelled to defend them. When Jackson took office in 1829, he made Eaton his Secretary of War. To Jackson, the appointment was a reward for loyalty and a declaration of trust. To Washington's elite, it was a scandal. The wives of cabinet members and high-ranking officials refused to socialize with the Eatons. Invitations were withdrawn, visits declined, and polite society closed its doors. At the head of this social resistance was Florid Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, who considered it her duty to uphold moral standards in the capital. She and the other cabinet wives declared, silently but firmly, that they would have nothing to do with Mrs. Eaton. Peggy was caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Her efforts to defend her reputation only seemed to make matters worse. When she attended official functions, people whispered. When she stayed home, they said she was sulking. Her beauty and confidence, the very traits that had once drawn admiration, were now portrayed as evidence of vanity and impropriety. Society demanded that she express shame, but Peggy Eaton refused to apologize for her life. She believed she had done nothing wrong, and that conviction only deepened the hostility around her. Andrew Jackson, watching from the White House, was infuriated. He saw in Peggy Eaton's suffering an echo of his late wife's pain, and he determined that this time he would not let society destroy another innocent woman. Jackson summoned his cabinet members and demanded that their wives show respect to Mrs. Eaton. But Washington's social rules were not so easily broken. The women would not yield, and their husbands, many of them dependent on their wives' social connections, refused to force the issue. The scandal grew, fed by whispers in parlors and speculation in newspapers. Meanwhile, the very foundation of Jackson's administration began to shake. Political alliances hardened along social lines. Those who supported the Eatons found themselves at odds with those who did not. Vice President Calhoun's camp, led by his wife, became openly hostile to the Eatons and by extension to Jackson himself. Only Martin Van Buren, Jackson's Secretary of State, stood firmly by the president's side. Van Buren, a widower with no wife to join the social boycott, treated Peggy Eaton with courtesy and respect. His tact and loyalty would later earn him Jackson's favor and a path to the presidency. Through it all, Peggy remained defiant. She continued to host gatherings and accompany her husband to official functions, even when few would attend. To her, the ostracism revealed the hypocrisy of the so-called high society, a world where men could indulge in moral failings without consequence, while women were condemned for even the appearance of impropriety. She once remarked that had she been less intelligent or less outspoken, no one would have cared what she did. But Peggy Eaton refused to play the role of the silent, penitent woman. She insisted on her dignity even when the cost was isolation. The more she resisted, the more vicious the gossip became. Stories circulated that she had flirted with men in public, that she manipulated Eaton for power, that she influenced the president himself. Most of it was fabrication, but perception mattered more than fact. In Washington, reputation could shape policy, destroy careers, and decide elections. The Petticoat Affair, as it came to be called, was no longer just a personal scandal. It was a political crisis. By the end of 1830, the rift in Jackson's cabinet was irreparable. Meetings turned tense, friendships dissolved, and government business ground to a halt. Jackson's determination to defend Peggy Eaton transformed the affair from social gossip into a constitutional headache. And through it all, Peggy remained at the center of the storm, unbroken, unrepentant, and unwilling to be erased. For her, love and loyalty had become acts of rebellion. For Jackson, the affair was a test of principle and power. And for Washington, it was a mirror held up to its own hypocrisy. a reminder that beneath the polished manners and moral preaching, the capital was ruled not only by law, but by rumor. The death of John Timberlake had been tragic, but what followed his passing changed the course of an entire administration. The marriage of Peggy and John Eaton became the lightning rod for a national debate over gender, class, and morality. And in defending her, Andrew Jackson would not only challenge the social elite, but also set in motion political consequences that would reshape his presidency. Peggy Eaton's story was no longer just about love or scandal. It was about power. The power of reputation, the power of defiance, and the power of a woman who refused to live by the expectations of others. In an age when a whisper could destroy a life, Margaret Eaton's voice refused to fade. Her quick marriage, her courage, and her defiance would soon unravel the bonds of loyalty at the highest levels of government and leave a mark on American history that no amount of gossip could erase. Andrew Jackson entered the White House in 1829 with triumph, rage, and a mission. The hero of New Orleans, the man of the people, had finally seized the presidency after years of bitter political struggle. But behind his rugged image and fiery populism lay deep personal wounds. The election of 1828 had been one of the dirtiest in American history, and his beloved wife, Rachel, had been one of its casualties. Branded an adulteress during the campaign because of a technicality in her divorce, Rachel Jackson had died before her husband's inauguration. Jackson blamed Washington's gossip and cruelty for her death. The grief hardened into resentment, and he entered the presidency with one vow: never again would he allow malicious whispers to destroy someone he cared about. That vow was put to the test almost immediately. His close friend and ally, John Henry Eaton, had married Margaret O'Neill Timberlake, now Mrs. Eaton. Jackson saw the marriage as honorable and proper, but to the women of Washington's elite, it was scandalous, indecent, even unforgivable. The Capitol's drawing rooms were abuzz with gossip about Peggy's past, her flirtations, and her swift remarriage after her first husband's death. These women, led by Florida Calhoun, wife of Vice President John C. Calhoun, took it upon themselves to defend what they considered moral purity. They began a silent, devastating campaign. They would not speak to, dine with, or even acknowledge Mrs. Eaton. The boycott spread quickly through Washington society. The wives of cabinet members, senators, and generals joined in, forming an invisible wall around Peggy Eaton. Invitations to dinners and receptions no longer arrived. When she appeared at official functions, conversations would stop and eyes would turn away. Her very presence seemed to challenge the code of respectability that the Capitol's women believed they upheld. Yet the cruelty of their exclusion went far beyond simple social snobbery. For in Washington, social acceptance was political capital. The wives' cold shoulders meant their husbands were forced into difficult positions. Either alienate the president by supporting the boycott or defy their own social circles by treating Peggy with respect. Andrew Jackson was incensed. To him, the attacks on Peggy Eaton were an exact repetition of the vile gossip that had destroyed his wife. He saw in Peggy not a scandalous woman, but an innocent victim of hypocrisy and cruelty. "She is chaste as a virgin," he thundered in private, "and these vipers dare to destroy her good name." Jackson summoned his cabinet, demanding that their wives show Mrs. Eaton the respect due to the wife of a cabinet secretary. But the social order of Washington was not easily bent, even by the President of the United States. The wives refused to yield, and the men, bound by both politics and domestic peace, could not compel them. Florida Calhoun's leadership in this boycott had consequences far beyond the drawing room. Her husband, Vice President John C. Calhoun, was already a man of strong pride and powerful ambition. He had his own disagreements with Jackson over states' rights and federal authority. Now, the feud over Peggy Eaton added a personal and moral edge to their political rivalry. The Calhouns represented the old Southern aristocracy, refined, proud, and deeply conscious of reputation. To them, the Eatons represented everything coarse and improper. What began as a social snub was rapidly turning into a political divide. Meanwhile, Peggy Eaton endured the cold fury of society with her characteristic mixture of pride and pain. She continued to appear at official events beside her husband, her head held high, even as whispers rippled through the room. Her beauty and confidence only seemed to deepen the hostility. To some, she became a symbol of defiance. a woman who refused to accept the narrow moral judgments of her peers. To others, she was the embodiment of everything they despised: bold, outspoken, unwilling to know her place. The tension reached into the very heart of Jackson's administration. Cabinet meetings grew tense and awkward. Behind closed doors, secretaries whispered about resignations. Husbands found themselves caught between loyalty to the president and obedience to their wives. Jackson, who had expected his cabinet to function as a team of loyal allies, instead found it paralyzed by gossip and resentment. The business of government slowed as personal animosity overshadowed national policy. Martin Van Buren, the Secretary of State, watched it all with careful eyes. A widower, he was free from the domestic entanglements that ensnared his colleagues. He treated Mrs. Eaton with kindness and respect, hosting her at dinners when no one else would. Jackson took note. Van Buren's loyalty and tact impressed him deeply, and in time, Jackson would reward him handsomely. But for now, the crisis deepened. For Jackson, the Petticoat Affair, as it came to be called, became a matter of honor. He saw himself fighting not merely for Peggy Eaton's reputation, but for a principle: that character should not be destroyed by rumor, and that no woman should be condemned without cause. His anger consumed his presidency's early months. He sent letters, held meetings, and even interrogated witnesses to clear Peggy's name. The President of the United States was devoting his energy not to foreign policy or domestic reform, but to a scandal born in parlors and whispered behind fans. The women of Washington, however, remained unmoved. They believed they were upholding the moral standards that gave respectability its meaning. To yield would be to admit that social virtue could be dictated by political power, and they would not bend. The result was stalemate. A battle between the president's will and society's judgment played out in the salons and drawing rooms of the Capitol. Through it all, Peggy Eaton remained a lightning rod for both sympathy and scorn. She insisted that she had done nothing wrong, that her marriage was honorable, and that the gossip against her was driven by jealousy and hypocrisy. Her courage in facing her detractors earned her admiration among those outside the elite circles, among the ordinary Americans who saw her as one of their own, persecuted by a corrupt and snobbish upper class. By the end of Jackson's first year in office, the scandal had spread far beyond Washington. Newspapers across the country reported on the Eaton malignity, turning private gossip into public spectacle. For the first time, Americans saw how deeply personal animosities could paralyze their government. The Petticoat Affair was no longer merely a story of love, jealousy, and morality. It had become a crisis of leadership. Andrew Jackson had entered the White House determined to protect the dignity of his friends and the memory of his wife. But in defending Peggy Eaton, he found himself fighting not just slander, but the entrenched power of social convention. The battle lines were drawn between the president and the vice president, between loyalty and pride, between the private world of women's influence and the public realm of political authority. And as the storm gathered, it became clear that this scandal would not only test Jackson's presidency, but reshape the alliances and destinies of every man who sat in his cabinet. The White House had become not just a seat of power, but a battlefield. And at its center stood a woman whom society had condemned, but a president refused to abandon. Andrew Jackson's fury over the treatment of Peggy Eaton was not merely the anger of a president defending a friend. It was the pain of a widower reliving his deepest wound. For Jackson, the whispers against Peggy were not new. They were echoes of the same cruelty that had taken the life of his beloved wife, Rachel. During the bitter election campaign of 1828, Rachel Jackson had been mercilessly slandered. Political opponents accused her of adultery, twisting a legal technicality in her divorce into a weapon of shame. The attacks spread across newspapers and taverns, tearing at her reputation. Rachel, a woman of deep faith and gentle spirit, was devastated. Before Jackson could take office, she suffered a heart attack and died, and the man who would soon be president blamed Washington's gossip for killing her. He buried her in Tennessee and swore with tears in his eyes that he would never forgive those who had destroyed her peace. Now, in 1829, he saw history repeating itself. Peggy Eaton, the lively daughter of a Washington innkeeper, was being destroyed in the same way, through whispers, judgment, and moral condemnation. To Jackson, the parallels were undeniable. The The same self-righteous voices that had shamed Rachel now sought to destroy another woman he cared about. "She is as chaste as a virgin," he declared to anyone who would listen, his voice trembling with rage. "And by the Eternal, I will protect her as I would have protected my own wife." Jackson's loyalty to Peggy was fierce, almost paternal. He had known her for years, first as the vivacious young woman who had charmed his Tennessee ally John Eaton, then as the target of cruel gossip that followed their marriage. To him, Peggy's enemies were Rachel's enemies, and he would fight them with the same unrelenting passion that had defined his life. But Jackson's personal crusade soon collided with political reality. The women of Washington society were not easily moved, and the men of his cabinet were trapped between the president's fury and their wives' social rebellion. Florid Calhoun, the vice president's wife, refused to yield. To her, Peggy Eaton's quick remarriage was an affront to decency, a violation of womanly virtue that no rank or favor could excuse. She and her circle believed they were defending morality itself, and Jackson's demands only strengthened their resolve. They viewed his defense of Peggy as a dangerous challenge to the moral order of their society. The more he insisted, the more they resisted. Jackson summoned his cabinet to the White House for what became known as the Petticoat meetings. He interrogated them like a general addressing mutinous officers, demanding loyalty to Mrs. Eaton. One by one, he asked whether they or their wives had wronged her. The meetings were tense and humiliating. The secretaries tried to explain that they could not control their wives' social choices, but Jackson would have none of it. To him, this was not a matter of etiquette, it was a test of honor. He wanted an oath of unity, a declaration that Peggy Eaton would be treated with the respect due the wife of a cabinet member. None of them could give it. The more the cabinet hesitated, the more Jackson's temper flared. He pounded his fist on the table, his voice rising to a shout. He recounted the torment Rachel had suffered, how gossip had poisoned her heart and left him a broken man. He accused his cabinet's wives of the same cruelty, the same sanctimonious hypocrisy. To those who dared defend Florid Calhoun, Jackson responded with icy fury. "These vipers destroyed the happiness of my dear wife. They shall not destroy another." Behind his anger lay something deeper, a sense of isolation. The capital that had mocked Rachel now mocked him. The very city he ruled seemed determined to wound him again through the suffering of another woman he admired. Peggy Eaton, in many ways, became Rachel's living shadow, a symbol of innocence betrayed and virtue maligned. Jackson's crusade for her was also a war for Rachel's memory. But in his relentless defense, Jackson was unknowingly driving his own cabinet toward collapse. The men under him began to whisper among themselves, weary of being drawn into their leader's private battles. Some believed the president's obsession with the scandal was blinding him to matters of state. Others, like Martin Van Buren, saw opportunity. Van Buren, a widower and a master of quiet diplomacy, sided openly with Peggy, earning Jackson's trust and gratitude. His charm and tact contrasted sharply with Calhoun's rigid pride, setting the stage for a political realignment that would change the future of the Democratic Party. Still, the scandal refused to die. The social war in Washington raged on, and Jackson's insistence only hardened the opposition. His enemies mocked him as a man ruled by emotion, incapable of separating the personal from the political. Yet to Jackson, the issue was moral, not political. He saw a world where powerful men hid behind their wives' virtue to destroy the reputations of the powerless, and he would not let that stand. In the evenings, he often sat alone in the White House, staring at Rachel's portrait, his thoughts consumed by the past. He had won the highest office in the land, but he could not escape the ghosts that haunted him. To defend Peggy Eaton was, in his mind, to defend Rachel, to prove, at last, that decency could triumph over gossip and love over cruelty. But Washington was unmoved. The whispers continued. The cabinet remained divided, and the scandal that had begun as a social feud was now poisoning the heart of the presidency itself. Jackson's fury had become the driving force of his administration, a fury born not from politics, but from grief. And as his anger deepened, so too did the cracks in his government. The man who had once conquered empires and humbled armies now found himself fighting a quieter, more insidious enemy, the unseen power of society's judgment. And in that battle, Andrew Jackson would learn that no amount of rage, no position of authority could silence the whispering of Washington's drawing rooms. The ghosts of scandal, his wife's and Peggy Eaton's, would haunt him long after the meetings ended. Washington, D.C. in the early 1830s was not merely the capital of a young republic. It was a battlefield of pride, gossip, and ambition. The Petticoat Affair had grown beyond the drawing rooms of the elite. It had become a war of loyalties that split the president's cabinet and poisoned the atmosphere of his administration. The scandal that began with whispers about a woman's virtue had now transformed into a national crisis, one that pitted friendship against morality, loyalty against ambition, and the President of the United States against his own vice president. The cabinet was divided into two irreconcilable camps. On one side stood Martin Van Buren, the Secretary of State, Jackson's trusted ally and political strategist. Van Buren was a widower, free from the pressures of an opinionated wife, and he used that freedom to support Peggy Eaton with quiet grace. Where others shunned her, he offered courtesy. Where others whispered, he smiled. To him, it was not just a matter of sympathy, but of opportunity. Van Buren saw that by standing beside Peggy Eaton, and by extension, Andrew Jackson, he could strengthen his bond with the president and secure his position as Jackson's heir apparent. On the other side stood Vice President John C. Calhoun, proud, brilliant, and unyielding. Calhoun's wife, Floride, was the unspoken general of the opposition. Her drawing room became the headquarters of Washington's social rebellion, where the wives of senators and secretaries gathered to reaffirm their boycott of Mrs. Eaton. They believed they were defending the honor of womanhood and the sanctity of morality itself. To them, Peggy Eaton's behavior, her boldness, her laughter, her swift remarriage, violated the code that separated ladies from scandal. To welcome her into their circle would be to betray their own virtue. Between these two forces, Washington society tore itself apart. Private dinners, receptions, and church services became stages for silent hostility. Invitations were weapons. A withheld greeting was a declaration of allegiance. The wives of Van Buren's allies sat on one side of the ballroom, the Calhoun women on the other. Cabinet members found themselves calculating each move, whom to invite, where to sit, how to avoid offending either faction. Even in church, the division was visible. Peggy Eaton would enter a pew, and the women nearby would quietly stand and move away. From the pulpits, ministers preached sermons on female virtue and chastity, their words dripping with moral implication. Everyone in the congregation knew who those sermons were meant for. In this poisonous atmosphere, governance ground to a halt. Jackson's cabinet, meant to be a council of statesmen, had become a theater of resentment. The secretaries could no longer meet without tension. Every discussion, even about national affairs, carried the shadow of the Eaton controversy. The president's fury had not faded, and his demands for loyalty only deepened the division. Jackson would defend Peggy Eaton's honor with the same fire that had carried him through battlefields. But the enemy now was gossip, not gunfire. Martin Van Buren, ever the tactician, maneuvered with patience. He invited Mrs. Eaton to dinners at his home, treating her with respect and warmth, while making sure word reached the president. Jackson, grateful for the loyalty, grew closer to Van Buren. In the president's mind, Van Buren represented decency and fidelity, a man of honor who stood by his friends. Calhoun, on the other hand, came to symbolize everything Jackson despised: arrogance, pride, and hypocrisy, masked as virtue. The political consequences of this social feud began to take shape. Jackson's trust in Calhoun eroded rapidly. The two men, once allies from the South, were now drifting toward open hostility. Their differences over states' rights and federal power were deepening, but the Eaton affair had made those differences personal. Jackson began to suspect Calhoun of disloyalty, and in the president's world, disloyalty was the gravest sin. The press, sensing scandal, seized upon the story with glee. Newspapers across the country published letters, poems, and columns debating the Eaton malignity. Some defended Peggy, praising her courage and mocking the hypocrisy of Washington's elite. Others condemned her as a corrupting influence on the administration. The story had everything the public craved: romance, betrayal, politics, and morality. It was America's first great political soap opera, played out not in Congress, but in parlors and pews. For ordinary citizens, the spectacle revealed the human flaws behind the grandeur of government. They saw the nation's leaders consumed by gossip while economic and social challenges went unresolved. Yet many common people sympathized with Peggy Eaton. To them, she was a woman of humble origins, shunned by the proud and the privileged for daring to rise above her station. The Jacksonian press painted her as a victim of aristocratic cruelty, a symbol of the very class divisions the president had promised to tear down. Inside the White House, Jackson's frustration mounted. He called meeting after meeting, demanding unity, pleading for reason, but no amount of presidential authority could mend the fractures in his cabinet. Each man was trapped, either by the stubborn pride of his wife or the fear of losing favor with the president. It was a conflict no law or policy could solve. The city itself seemed to take sides. Gossip filled the taverns, churches, and corridors of power. Every rumor, true or false, was magnified. Letters from diplomats and socialites described the capital as a city divided by a woman. Jackson's administration, once built on loyalty and friendship, was now collapsing under the weight of personal grievance. And yet, amid the turmoil, Martin Van Buren's star rose higher. His unwavering support for Peggy Eaton earned Jackson's absolute trust. He became the president's confidant, his political son, and the one man who could calm his rage. In contrast, Calhoun's rigid moralism alienated Jackson further. The vice president's silence in his wife's campaign of exclusion was seen not as dignity, but as betrayal. By 1831, Washington was in open social war. Cabinet members avoided one another. Official dinners were sparsely attended or marked by cold formality. The Petticoat Affair had evolved from a scandal into a symbol of class versus commoner, virtue versus loyalty, and Southern pride versus populist power. What had begun with a marriage now threatened to destroy a presidency. The capital was divided, and Andrew Jackson's dream of a united administration lay in ruins. But from the ashes of this social disaster, a new alliance was forming, one that would define the next generation of American politics. For in the ruins of the Petticoat Affair, Martin Van Buren was quietly positioning himself as the heir to Jackson's legacy, while John C. Calhoun began his transformation into Jackson's most formidable enemy. The War of Whispers had become a war for power, and its echoes would reach far beyond the drawing rooms of Washington. By 1830, the Petticoat Affair had grown from a social squabble into a full-blown political crisis that threatened to cripple Andrew Jackson's presidency. What had begun as whispered gossip in Washington's parlors now dominated the business of government. Cabinet meetings were consumed not by policy, but by personal resentment. The very men Jackson had chosen for their loyalty and strength were now divided, suspicious, and weary. The government of the United States was paralyzed, not by foreign enemies or domestic unrest, but by the social war over one woman's reputation. Jackson's fury burned hotter with each passing month. He called private, closed-door meetings of his cabinet, hoping to end the turmoil and defend Peggy Eaton's honor once and for all. These meetings often turned into interrogations, with the president demanding that his secretaries declare whether they or their wives had wronged Mrs. Eaton. It was a humiliation few could bear. Some tried to placate him. Others sat in silence, knowing that nothing they said could satisfy his rage. Every attempt to restore harmony only deepened the wounds. The issue refused to die. Washington society, meanwhile, thrived on the spectacle. Newspapers printed every rumor, feeding a public hungry for scandal. Cartoonists drew satirical sketches of Peggy Eaton seated beside Jackson, whispering into his ear. The power behind the throne, they called her. Political opponents seized on the chaos to portray the administration as unfit to govern. To them, Jackson's obsession with defending Peggy was proof that the new populist president lacked the refinement and restraint expected of the nation's leader. The image of a White House consumed by gossip, feuds, and emotion was irresistible to Jackson's enemies. For Jackson, however, the affair was never about gossip. It was about honor, loyalty, and justice. He saw himself as a man defending an innocent woman against the cruelty of an elite class that despised anyone of humble origin. In Peggy Eaton's suffering, he saw the reflection of Rachel's pain. Every insult against Peggy was in his eyes an insult against his late wife's memory. His determination to vindicate her was absolute. Yet his personal crusade was destroying the very unity he sought to protect. Within the cabinet, the rift had become irreparable. On one side stood Martin Van Buren, calm, composed, and loyal. always ready to defend Mrs. Eaton. On the other stood Vice President John C. Calhoun, proud and unyielding, whose wife, Florid, remained the social leader of the anti-Eaton faction. Their husbands' rivalry now mirrored their wives' hostility. What had begun as a war of morals had become a war of political survival. Every dinner, every conversation, every gesture was a test of allegiance. Even outside government, the divisions spread. Diplomats avoided social events for fear of offending one side or the other. Ministers preached sermons on female virtue that barely concealed their opinions of the scandal. Members of Congress whispered that the president had lost control of his own administration. Foreign visitors, astonished by the spectacle, wrote home describing Washington as a city obsessed with scandal and crippled by pride. Jackson's critics mocked him for allowing a social dispute to consume his presidency. They accused him of turning the White House into a personal battlefield and of mistaking gossip for governance. His allies, however, saw a different story. A man of principle, refusing to abandon a friend because it was politically convenient. To ordinary Americans, the Petticoat Affair revealed a clash between two worlds: the polished, aristocratic elite of Washington and the rough, populist spirit of Jacksonian democracy. Peggy Eaton, whether she wanted it or not, had become a symbol of class struggle, the daughter of an innkeeper defying the moral judgment of society's self-appointed guardians. But inside the administration, the toll was devastating. Secretaries stopped trusting one another. Policy discussions were overshadowed by personal resentment. National issues, tariffs, banking, and expansion faded into the background. The machinery of government ground slower and slower. Jackson, for all his determination, could not command loyalty from men whose households openly defied him. The Petticoat Affair had made him look not strong, but obsessed. By late 1830, even Jackson's closest allies began to worry that the scandal might destroy his presidency. Martin Van Buren, ever the strategist, recognized that the cabinet was beyond repair. In private, he began to plan a solution, one that would remove the problem entirely and preserve Jackson's honor in the process. He offered to resign, hoping that his example would prompt others to do the same. His quiet maneuvering would soon bring the crisis to its breaking point. Meanwhile, Peggy Eaton remained defiant. Though isolated, she refused to retreat from public life. She attended events, walked proudly through streets where others turned their heads, and maintained that she had done nothing wrong. Her courage or stubbornness, depending on whom you asked, only fueled the fire. For the women who opposed her, every public appearance was a provocation. For Jackson, it was proof of her innocence and strength. Outside Washington, ordinary citizens watched the spectacle unfold through the newspapers. Some laughed at the absurdity of politicians brought low by social intrigue. Others sympathized with Peggy, seeing her as the victim of an aristocratic conspiracy. The affair divided public opinion as deeply as it divided the government. For a young nation still defining its identity, the scandal revealed the fragile line between public virtue and private prejudice. By the end of 1830, the Petticoat Affair had consumed nearly every ounce of Jackson's energy. The man who had once faced down British armies and dueling pistols now found himself defeated by the invisible power of gossip and social pressure. The president's cabinet, once bound by loyalty, had become a circle of resentment and silence. His enemies rejoiced, his friends worried, and his legacy teetered on the edge of ridicule. The scandal that began with a marriage had become a storm that threatened to destroy an entire administration. But Jackson was not yet finished. He would not yield to the forces that mocked him. And in his next move, one as dramatic as any battle he had ever fought, the president would sweep away his cabinet, reshape his government, and in the process, alter the course of American politics forever. For John C. Calhoun, the Petticoat Affair was not merely a social embarrassment. It was the spark that ignited his political downfall. Once regarded as a brilliant statesman and the natural heir to Andrew Jackson's presidency, Calhoun found his ambitions crushed under the weight of personal resentment and social defiance. What began as a disagreement over a woman's place in Washington society became a clash of egos and principles that would reshape his destiny and alter the balance of American politics. In the early years of Jackson's administration, Calhoun had stood at the center of power. As vice president, he was one of the most respected men in the nation, known for his intellect, his commanding presence, and his uncompromising beliefs. But in the salons and drawing rooms of Washington, his wife, Floride Calhoun, led the charge against Peggy Eaton. Her refusal to acknowledge the Secretary of War's wife became a symbol of moral resistance among elite women. It was Floride who set the tone of defiance, and John C. Calhoun, whether through pride or loyalty, stood by her side. At first, Calhoun saw the dispute as a trivial matter, a domestic quarrel unworthy of political concern. But when Jackson made it clear that loyalty to Peggy Eaton was a test of loyalty to him, the vice president found himself trapped. To yield would mean surrendering to Jackson's will. To resist would invite the president's wrath. Calhoun chose resistance. His stubbornness, born of principle and pride, turned a private feud into a political war. Jackson, already haunted by the memory of his late wife Rachel's suffering, saw in Calhoun's defiance not just disobedience but betrayal. The president's anger was relentless. He began to view Calhoun as an enemy within his own ranks, a man of arrogance and hypocrisy who cloaked his ambitions in moral virtue. Each social slight against Peggy Eaton became, in Jackson's mind, another act of rebellion against his authority. The bond between the president and his vice president shattered. The damage was irreparable. Jackson turned his affection and trust toward Martin Van Buren, the smooth, tactful Secretary of State who had stood loyally beside him and shown courtesy to Peggy when others would not. In Van Buren, Jackson found not only a political ally, but a man who understood the value of loyalty and strategy. In Calhoun, he saw the opposite, a divisive figure whose pride threatened the unity of the administration. The Petticoat Affair, more than any policy or speech, decided who would shape the next chapter of American politics. For Calhoun, the fallout was devastating. His image as Jackson's natural successor crumbled. The public began to see him as a man out of step with the populist spirit of the age. Cold, aristocratic, and self-righteous. His feud with Jackson grew into open hostility, fueled further by their clash over the nullification crisis in which Calhoun defended South Carolina's right to reject federal laws. The political alliance that once seemed destined to dominate the decade had turned into one of the fiercest rivalries in American history. Floride Calhoun's role in the scandal only deepened the bitterness. In Washington society, she remained defiant, unrepentant, convinced she had acted in defense of moral decency. But her social victory was hollow. By refusing to yield, she had cost her husband the trust of the most powerful man in America. As the Calhouns withdrew from the capital, their influence waned, and their names became synonymous with resistance, not to scandal, but to the very authority of the presidency. Back in South Carolina, Calhoun transformed his humiliation into ideology. He abandoned the pursuit of the presidency and instead became the intellectual champion of states' rights and nullification. His speeches thundered with defiance against federal power, and his arguments laid the foundation for the conflicts that would one day tear the Union apart. The man who had once dined at the president's table now stood as his fiercest ideological opponent, proclaiming that liberty itself was endangered by centralized authority. To many observers, the Petticoat Affair marked the moment Calhoun's national career began to decline and his sectional career began to rise. The rejection he suffered in Washington drove him deeper into the politics of the South, and the South in turn embraced him as its voice. His transformation from vice president to rebel thinker was complete. Where he had once spoken for the Union, he now spoke for a region preparing to challenge it. Yet even as his political philosophy grew more powerful, Calhoun could never escape the shadow of the scandal that had brought him low. His enemies mocked him as the man who lost the presidency over a social quarrel. His allies whispered that had it not been for the Petticoat Affair, he might have steered the nation in a different direction. One less divided, less bitter, less doomed to conflict. History would remember him as brilliant but flawed, proud but undone by his own sense of moral superiority. For Andrew Jackson, Calhoun's downfall was both personal revenge and political victory. For John C. Calhoun, it was the beginning of a long retreat from national unity into sectional defiance. And for the nation, the feud that began over the reputation of one woman became a foreshadowing of greater divisions yet to come, the kind that would test the Union itself. The Petticoat Affair had destroyed friendships, ended political careers, and reshaped the future of the Democratic Party. But for Calhoun, it did something more lasting. It stripped away the illusion of harmony in American politics and revealed the deep fractures of pride, honor, and ideology that lay just beneath the surface. From that moment on, he was no longer the Vice President of the United States. He was the prophet of a coming storm. In the years that followed, the echoes of the Petticoat Affair slowly faded from the bustling halls of Washington, but its scars remained etched upon the reputations and memories of all who had lived through it. The Eatons, once at the center of scandal and gossip, withdrew from public life. Margaret Peggy Eaton, once admired for her charm and wit, then despised as a symbol of impropriety, lived out her later years under the shadow of the controversy that had consumed her youth. Though she would outlive many of her detractors, the whispers never truly died. In the eyes of polite society, her name was forever linked to scandal, her story a cautionary tale of ambition, defiance, and the peril of challenging convention. John Eaton resigned from Jackson's cabinet in 1831. His political future effectively ended. He later served as governor of the Florida Territory and as U.S. Minister to Spain, but his career never regained its former luster. He had been a loyal friend to Jackson, yet that loyalty had come at a heavy personal cost. For Peggy, public disgrace was a constant companion. Even in her later marriage to an Italian dancing instructor, a union that again shocked the Washington elite, she found herself condemned anew. The very traits that had once made her fascinating, her independence, her boldness, her unwillingness to submit, had branded her an outcast in the rigid world of 19th century respectability. Andrew Jackson, for his part, never forgot what the Petticoat Affair revealed about the society he governed. To him, the episode was not a mere scandal, but a moral test of loyalty and principle. In Peggy Eaton's treatment, he saw a reflection of the cruelty that had destroyed his beloved wife, Rachel. The slander and gossip that had driven Rachel to despair now replayed before him in the torment of another woman. And just as he had once sworn vengeance against those who maligned his wife, he now swore to defend Peggy Eaton's honor as though it were Rachel's own. But Jackson's defense of Peggy came at a price. The scandal fractured his cabinet, poisoned his relationship with Vice President Calhoun, and forced a political realignment that changed the course of American history. In driving away his enemies and rewarding his loyalists, Jackson transformed the presidency itself. The Petticoat Affair taught him that personal loyalty was the only true currency in politics. And he would spend the rest of his presidency surrounding himself with men he trusted above all others. Among those men was Martin Van Buren, whose calm and careful diplomacy throughout the affair had earned Jackson's gratitude. Van Buren had shown courtesy to Peggy Eaton when others would not. He had maneuvered skillfully through the political storm, offering the president both comfort and strategy. When Jackson finally purged his cabinet, Van Buren emerged as his most trusted advisor. The friendship born from scandal would soon propel Van Buren to the vice presidency and eventually to the presidency itself. In that sense, the Petticoat Affair was not merely a personal drama, but a turning point in American politics, one that reshaped the line of succession in the White House. As for Washington society, the scandal left behind an uneasy legacy. The rigid social hierarchy that had condemned Peggy Eaton remained intact, but the hypocrisy of its gatekeepers had been exposed. The Petticoat Affair had shown that the line between public duty and private morality was perilously thin, and that the reputations of women could be destroyed not by law or reason, but by gossip and exclusion. The capital learned that power was not held only in government offices, but also in drawing rooms, parlors, and whispers, and that the social elite could wound a presidency as easily as any political rival. In the broader sweep of history, the Petticoat Affair stood as an early example of how gender, class, and morality intertwined with politics in the young republic. It was a reminder that even in the heart of a democratic government, social prejudice could dictate the course of political destiny. Peggy Eaton's defiance, Jackson's outrage, Calhoun's fall, and Van Buren's rise all emerged from the same collision between personal virtue and public judgment. When Jackson reflected on the affair in his later years, he saw in it the embodiment of everything he despised about the Washington establishment. The whispers, the arrogance, the moral double standards. To him, they were proof that the so-called refined classes cared more for appearances than for justice. The scandal hardened his distrust of elites and deepened his resolve to champion the common man against the entrenched powers of society. What his enemies saw as a disgrace, Jackson saw as vindication of his cause. For the nation, the Petticoat Affair became a cautionary tale, a story of how private lives could upend public power. It revealed how fragile political alliances could be when tested by pride and prejudice. And it reminded future presidents that the personal was never truly separate from the political. As time passed, the details blurred, but the lessons endured. Peggy Eaton lived to see the rise and fall of those who had once scorned her. She died in 1879, an old woman who had outlasted a generation of enemies, but never escaped their judgment. Yet her story survived, not as gossip, but as history. A reminder that the measure of a woman, and indeed a nation, is often tested not by virtue alone, but by how it treats those whom society chooses to condemn. In the end, the Petticoat Affair was more than a scandal. It was a mirror held up to the soul of a young republic, reflecting its ideals, its hypocrisies, and its struggle to reconcile private morality with public duty. From its smoke rose the ambitions of some and the ruin of others, but its legacy endured as one of the earliest and most human dramas ever to unfold in the halls of American power.